Hello, and welcome to our screencast for Justice as Fairness, Part 1. And this one will cover the reading number 1 from John Rawls. I'll give you some background before we dive in. However, you may have encountered John Rawls if you've taken another philosophy class. He would get mentioned maybe in a survey of an intro to philosophy, or in an ethical system sometimes. He was a political philosopher who worked for a long time at Harvard University, and he spent his academic life trying to develop a theoretical political system that can guarantee both, on the one hand, these individual liberties that liberalism has as a core value, but also enough equality that every citizen of any particular state or government has the opportunity to pursue their goals. So this seesawing that we see often, well, we want the individual liberty to accumulate wealth and to build up the markets and to give massive sums of money to whoever I want when I die. And over the years, of course, we've seen this kind of economic market freedom turn into wealth and opportunity inequality. We live in a world that has a very sizable level of inequality, in which just a small percentage of most countries in the world own most of the wealth, most of the means of production, and thus also hold most of the political power. So liberalism as an ideology, as a political philosophy, has shifted over time. When we looked at its origins in Hobbes and Locke and its morph into utility, looking for the greatest happiness for the most, and being married to an economic system where it splits a little bit, and some liberals think the government's job is to focus not just on liberties of economics, but also other kinds of liberties. But so far, we haven't necessarily seen a satisfactory account of how we can have a liberal government that protects both these individual liberties and the equality of opportunity. So, if you're born, let's think of one of the worst case scenarios, into a country that has been in the midst of war for decades, and there are no real roads or hospitals or schools left, and all that the people can do as their life goal is to attempt to survive. There isn't a lot of social or political structure that supports them, or maybe even any. And our environment, the ones that we're born into society, we're born into politics, we're born into governments, and we can't opt out, affect what goals we can even possibly have in our lives. Our contexts matter. So if we live in a world, which we do, where wealth and political power are ultra concentrated, that limits the vast majority of the rest of the citizens to make free choices. So, of course, we've seen other authors who have pointed out some of the flaws of classical liberalism and how it's developed over the past couple hundred years. And then they try to develop methods to remedy those problems. When we read Dewey, he called for the socialization of industry, and a radical restructuring of how we educate people to think of themselves as empowered citizens. We saw Marx and Engels want to get rid of liberalism altogether. We don't even want to worry about individual rights and liberties. We just want to make everything equal all the time. Destroy all competitive markets and private property. Thus, people must be more equal going forward. They can fully participate in life if there's no massive inequality preventing them from doing so. We just looked at Nussbaum. So all these people that we've talked about before focused almost exclusively on economic wealth as a marker of the well-being of a people in a government. But she says we need to open our understanding of human well-being to all of our capabilities. And there are more markers than just wealth that tells you if somebody is flourishing in life, if somebody has the opportunity to choose their own good, their own goals, their own ends. Now we'll take a look at Rawls, who explains his 2 principles of justice. And he thinks that these 2 principles of justice have to be in place in any democratic nation in order to structure society so that we can all cooperate to produce more and better things, both physically and these more abstract life goals through the generations. He wants to keep it stable instead of letting things concentrate in the small number of hands over time. So we need to set up a world, in other words, where everybody has the opportunity to pursue their own goals. And you just can't do that unless there is a social, political, and economic structure that is open to everybody. Another thing you might have run into if you have read Rawls before is his thought experiment about the original position. And he only sort of tangentially mentions it here, but I'm going to give you a little bit of background on it. So I mentioned that he has 2 principles of justice that he thinks has to be in place for every society to ensure this balance between rights and liberties and equality of opportunity. So what are these 2 principles and how did he derive them? One way that he did so, and there were other ways, is this thought experiment. Philosophers love thought experiments. They are logically possible scenarios that point to, I would say, the structure of an argument. Sometimes they're not really all that realistic, but they're like the extreme or the end point. So if your point of view holds for the extreme, it's going to hold for all the weaker stuff as well. So let's think about what the original position is. He asks us to imagine that we're all sitting down to make a new constitution for a new government. And how are we going to do that? What is it that is going to bias us when we try and set down principles, rules, or laws for this new nation? And the answer is, of course, pretty much everything about us, right? If we were going to set up a new system, we're going to try to make it so that we're advantaged because we all have particular goals. We all have particular understandings of what is right and what is wrong. We all want the opportunity and the chance to live a good life. So all these things that shape who we are as individuals, the income of your family when you were born, the social status of your family when you were born, your identity, which could be a mixture of any of these things and more, your race, your gender, your sex, your disability status, your religion, your personal values, your sexuality. We all have differing levels of innate natural abilities. Some people are smarter than others. Some people are more athletic than others. Some people are more charismatic than others. There's a varying level that's distributed across the population. Luck is also always going to play a factor. You might be from a family that is wealthy and has a lot of power, but you might have bad luck. You might get a terminal illness or make a couple of bad choices. But when we talk about luck, we're more talking about things that you can't control. So things like an economic downturn, you can't control that, and that might directly affect the range of opportunities open to you. Also, the things, your personal experiences in life have biased you. So you can imagine 20 people sitting down and they all come from 20 different points of view when they're trying to make this basic constitution. So how can we come to any agreement whatsoever? We have to think about what we have in common. When we want to say that we all want the right to vote, we all want the right to move around freely, to congregate, to have an open and free press. These are all maybe specific instances of things we have in common, but we want to find the root of them. And you might know the answer to what we all have in common if you've read Western philosophy for any length of time. The thing that we all have in common, the root of everything we have in common, is that we can use practical reasoning to plan out our lives, to plan out the structure of our communities. We can all do that. In addition, we all want a fair opportunity, a fair shot to live a good life. And we're all going to define what good is differently. That's one thing that a modern political structure, a democratic one, has to take into account. The government shouldn't be restricting your autonomy and telling you this is how you live a good life, like perhaps a communist country would aim to. Instead, all those particular markers that make you who you are will help you to define your own good in life, your own end in life, your own goals. I might want to be wealthy. Someone else might want to be famous. Someone else might want to cure a disease. Someone else might want to help other people, or live on the ocean, or be in nature a lot. The idea is that we can all define our own goods. So since we have all this in common, that we know we have our own good and we want an opportunity to reach that good, plus we can reason and plan our personal lives and our communities, Rawls is going to put us under what he calls the veil of ignorance. That's all we know about ourselves. We lose all of our identity markers. We don't know how rich we are. We don't know how poor we are. We don't know if we're men, women, Muslim, Christian, atheist. We might be sickly. We might be really smart. We might be really stupid. We might like to be outside. We might like to be inside. We don't know any of that stuff. We're under the veil of ignorance, and all we know is that we want a fair opportunity to live a good life, however we define good, and we can plan out our lives. So what would this group, who are under the veil of ignorance, decide for a constitution in a new government? This is what Rawls calls the original position. We're under the veil of ignorance, and we have to decide what's best for everybody, because we could be any one in the entire range of possibilities. We could be the worst off person in the entire world. Maybe we're very poor and we live in a society that devalues our sex and our sexuality and our gender and our skin color and our religion. And we tend to get sick a lot. And you get the point. There's somebody in the world or some group of people that are very bad off. And you might be that person because you're under the veil of ignorance. So that means even if you get that worse luck and you are one of the worst off in the world, you want to be guaranteed at least basic rights. So that means that this rational community in the original position would choose a set of rules that guarantees everyone at least a basic set of human rights. And that's the first principle of justice that he thinks all rational people would agree to or should agree to. Number one, each person has the same indefeasible claim to a fully adequate scheme of equal basic liberties, which is compatible for the same scheme of liberties for everybody. Okay, indefeasible means they're not defeatable. They're the fundamental rule that everybody would agree you need it, or you don't live in a just society, or you don't live in a fair society. And those equal basic liberties, we can go into detail a bit more later, but for now, you should just think of them as like the rights guaranteed in the Bill of Rights. The freedom of conscience, which means you can choose your own religion. Freedom from unreasonable search and seizure, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to gather together. So it's compatible because everybody can have them, and they can't be defeated. They're the most fundamental to having a just state. But you can think of all possible constitutions. And your constitution can just be, well, I'm writing the constitution, so I'm the supreme ruler and king, and I get all the money, and I have all the power, all the way to something like a communist state where ideally everybody has the same exact amount of power, and everything in between. And Rawls says that only some subset, only some small group of those actually qualify as just. And in order for any sort of constitution, and you can think of constitution as both a written or unwritten document, like the one that we have, but think about the other meaning of the word. When you constitute something, it's the elements that are comprised of that thing. You are creating something new. You're constituting a new state. And what are the parts of that state? If you cook a pizza, you're constituting that pizza with yeast and wheat and tomato sauce and cheese, etc. So when you constitute a new state, one of the elements for it to be just is that everybody has to have these equal basic liberties, because that's what's fair. The second thing that this new state has to have in order for it to be just is the second principle of justice. And Rawls says the second one is social and economic inequalities are to satisfy two conditions. First, they're to be attached to offices and positions open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. And second, they are to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged members of society. And that second part right there is what he calls the difference principle. Okay, so offices and positions open to all. We can think about that as all of the jobs in our entire economy, or if somebody's life is less than economic, there are other roles that you can have. You can be a stay-at-home mom, maybe you're a traveling artist, I don't know. There just can be a million niches in society, roles that you fulfill. And his idea for things to be just is every single one of them has to be theoretically open to everybody. No, not even theoretically. Actually open for everyone to possibly get if they decide that that's their goal. So maybe you want to work really hard and become a doctor, or maybe you value your free time more and you just do odd jobs so you can go hiking all the time. So yes, that inequality is going to be okay there because you had the opportunity to pick which role you wanted to fulfill. But it all has to be open to you. So you can imagine we tell kids that everybody could be president one day as long as you're a citizen, but most people don't think that that's true. Of course, wealth matters, the class you come from matters, and that's not just, Rawls would say, because of this first part of the second principle of justice. And the second part of the second principle of justice is that we can only allow inequality if it benefits the least advantaged members of society. So this prevents, hopefully, wealth and power from becoming ultra concentrated. This is going a tiny bit longer than I had expected. I am going to have to break this video up into part 1A and part 1B, I think, but I'll give it another couple minutes for part 1A. Okay, so why these two principles of justice? Rawls says that they're necessary to ensure that every single person can participate cooperatively in life. So remember in the first half of the semester, we had some thinkers who said to promote social cooperation was one of the highest things that made a government legitimate. But we never really went into a whole lot of detail about what that could possibly mean, and Rawls wants to pull out that concept. So yes, we have competition in life, but we also work together as a whole to make sure that society is stable and safe. That's one of the whole basic reasons this whole semester we've talked about why we enter into a governmental state at all. We know that we can build more and do more and have more and fulfill more of our goals if we live cooperatively in a society. But to have us flourish on our highest levels, we need both of those principles of justice. It's the background structure that enforces not complete equality, but enforces a place in which power and wealth can't become concentrated in a tiny amount of hands, thus denying almost all opportunities to a big segment of the population. So that was my background, and now we can jump right into the text itself, even though some of it was from the text itself, sort of going back and forth. And I want to remind you, because Rawls has a bit of a technical style to his writing, that especially when you are reading something coming from a professional academic aimed at other professional academics, there's going to be a lot of jargon. It's going to be at a highly abstract level. It's going to have little flourishes that maybe you don't understand, and I want to remind you that that's fine. It's okay if you don't understand every little tiny bit of definition and argument structure that he has in there. We're going to work through it together. We're going to get the main ideas. And sometimes when you're just approaching a difficult subject, that's fine. That's fine for a first pass. It will get easier, and the struggle that you go through is actually helping to improve your systems of critical thought. I actually think that is where I will end part 1A. So I'll see you in part 1B.